This is January 15th, 2024, and today we are talking to Angelika Rooney. My name is Kara Jacobs, and we are talking with Angie in Fair Oaks, California, and the interview will be conducted in English. So, may I call you Angie?
Yes, please.
Angie, tell us a little bit about your parents.
Okay, I'll start with my
Where
mother.
they were born, when they were born, a little bit about their early lives before you came into the picture.
Right. I'll start with my mother. My mother was born in Temesvar, which was Hungary at the time, is Romania today, and to Jewish parents. And she grew up mostly in Berlin. She spent the First World War in Berlin with her grandparents because she wanted a good education. And my grandfather was served with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. And he came back after the war with tuberculosis, and he took 6 years to die. After he died in 1924, the family, my grandmother took her 4 children to Berlin to be near her parents. Her parents had already been in Berlin for, I think, at least since the turn of the century, if not earlier. They were all originally from Budapest. And she grew up in Berlin. Berlin was her heart and soul. But they were Yugoslav citizens through their father because their father was from what is today Serbia, a large city in Serbia, actually the second largest city, Novi Sad, on the Danube. And all of his family had lived there for a very long time. But that was Hungary when he was born. And as I said, he died in 1924, just before my mother's 15th birthday. And that ended her childhood. It ended childhood for all the children. She was the oldest in the family. And they moved permanently to Berlin. My grandmother was an expert seamstress, and she set up a couture house. Eventually, it became quite successful, and she made lovely dresses for people like Marlene Dietrich and so forth. And all of that came to an end at Kristallnacht. And Kristallnacht was kind of an open secret, and that there was going to be violence. And the Yugoslav embassy sent a guard to stand in front of her business, so it was not ransacked. But then immediately afterwards, in the next couple of days, the Yugoslav embassy called them in, the family in, and said, "We can't protect you anymore. You need to leave. You need to go home." And so they made plans to go safe places. They decided to split up as a family to survive and to be a lifeline for each other. My aunt got a visa to London. She spent the war years in London during the Blitz. My mother went to Shanghai. We'll be talking more about that. She was engaged at the time, and she went with her fiance and his family. And my uncle took his mother, his youngest sister, who was quite a bit younger than the other children, and his grandmother back first to Yugoslavia, to Novi Sad, and then eventually to Budapest. And the family in Yugoslavia, they were very close to those people. Those were my grandfather's family. Most of those people died in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. He had the survival gene. My uncle had the survival gene. And he had also spoke many languages, and he had his ear to the ground, and he knew that something horrible was going to happen in Novi Sad to the Jews of Novi Sad. So he took his direct family back to Budapest, and the relatives all said he was panicking needlessly, and he didn't have any patience, and so forth and so on. My uncle and my grandmother and my great-grandmother all survived, and most of the other relatives in Novi Sad died in the Shoah, died in the Holocaust. My mother's youngest sister, and we'll get to this later in Shanghai, but her youngest sister died in the Holocaust. She went out for bread during the worst of times after the Nazis took Budapest in 1944. and she was arrested on the street and never seen again. And she was unfortunately also not quite, she was developmentally slow. She'd been given a vaccination that was not quite tested when her father was so ill with tuberculosis, and she had convulsions, was hospitalized and so forth. And she was about 3, and she was never quite the same again. It wasn't that she was, she was slow, and the family, everybody protected her. They loved her very much, but she was willful, she was spoiled, and she went out for bread and was never seen again. And that sort of brings you up to date on my mother's family. My father was from Munich, Germany. He was born in Munich, and his heart was in Munich. And his father had been a veteran of the First World War also. As I said, my mother's father served in the Austro-Hungarian army, and my father's father served in the German army, a Bavarian infantry brigade. He was a captain in the army. He was very interested, in fact, both grandfathers, in modernity, in assimilation. They thought they were, that they were good German citizens. My grandfather was wounded probably around Verdun, the Battle of Verdun. He served in Belgium and France on what we would say the wrong side today, but that was the side he fought on. And he got many commendations. I have his medals right here. I actually have his Iron Crosses that were the honorable ones, not the defiled ones of the Nazis in the Second World War, but the First World War ones. And his battalion book, I have all that right here for anybody who wants to see it. And he thought that the whole Nazi thing would blow over. My grandfather was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He had a very thriving, going business. My grandparents had an art gallery in Munich where they sold museum quality paintings of German artists. In fact, the seminal painting for the Frye Art Museum in Seattle, Washington came from their gallery. And the Frye Museum is the top German art museum in the United States. And so he thought it would all blow over, but his teenage son, who was hot-headed and seemed to get from one scrape to another, he was very worried about him. My father was brilliant, but also stubborn. And he was a young kid. He was sent to school in Italy for a year because he wasn't doing well in school in Germany because he didn't like any of the regimentation during the Nazi period. In fact, I remember asking my father one time why he didn't know right from left, because he was a brilliant man. He said, I deliberately unlearned that because they made us march at school, that kind of situation. And he spent a year in, I'm not sure it was a year, in Cyprus with an uncle of his. But in the end, he had to come back to Germany, and his father said, you have to buckle down and have a career and do something with yourself. But he was, he became an engineer. But since he was very emotional, and things were very difficult for him because he was only a half-Jewish child, because his mother was not Jewish. And so he was considered Jewish by the Nazi authorities and considered not Jewish by the Jewish community. He had a very hard time. And eventually his parents, and I think it must have been probably his mother more than his father, because my grandparents were divorced already by that point in time. My grandparents had married in 1914, and they divorced in 1938, forced by the Nazi political situation, because they had the art gallery, which meant everything particularly to my grandmother. My grandfather didn't have a choice. The only way she was going to keep her business, and she said, whether it was true or not, she said she was keeping it so that my father would have something to come back to when he came back from Shanghai. He had no intention of ever living in Germany again, though. And so they got him out of Germany with false papers. My father was a very brave man. He had nerves of steel, but he was always afraid of flying, for example. And my mother explained to me one time that was because when he was on the plane leaving Munich to go to Shanghai, he was flying to Trieste and then on to Genoa. The Gestapo came on the plane again. They'd been on several times and checked papers. And that was a terrifying event. He was 19 years old. He was a kid going by himself to an unknown place. And he just didn't, he had that trauma of the flight. He eventually left Europe on a Japanese, on an Italian liner, the Cortellazzo. And in May of 1939, and my mother left Berlin, again going by train to Genoa, and picked up a ship there, an NYK Japanese liner, and went to Shanghai, and they both went through the Suez Canal. I have a picture of mother going through the Suez Canal, and those ships were all chartered by various organizations, Jewish organizations, other philanthropic Jewish organizations, and the Germans themselves, because their policy at that point in time was not to annihilate the Jewish community, but to get rid of them. They wanted to make Germany Judenrein, Jew-free. And so, they forced people out, and people, had to beggar themselves with all the fees and the fines and everything else that went through it. You were allowed to take out of Germany 10 Deutschmark at the time, Reichsmark, and that was the equivalent at the time of $2.50 US. So you took nothing with you. And my mother, who had nerves of steel as well, had in her fist, as she went through the last Gestapo checkpoint, a crumpled up American $20 bill, which was a lot of money at the time, that she took out with her. And what else can I tell you about their backgrounds, other than people were trying to flee? About 280,000 people made it out of Europe at that point in time after the Nazis took over Germany. That was 3% of the 9 million Jews that were in Europe at the time, and 6 million died, as we all know. Any questions at this point?
Yes, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about any cultural or Jewish cultural or religious practices or affiliations or ties that either of your parents had.
Very little about my mother's. Very little about my mother's. They seemed to have been very assimilated. She never talked about that at all, other than to say that when she was a child, a great aunt or some relative wanted to pay the children to go to a temple, and instead of going to the movies, and my mother was very headstrong, apparently, said that nobody could pay her to go she'd make up her own mind. She must have been about 9 or 10 at the time. And my father never spoke about any kind of religious practices at all, but my great aunt, the only survivor on his side of his family, of his father's family, who spent the war years in Theresienstadt. Before the war, she and my grandfather spent the last horrible years in Munich together. They lived together, from one apartment to another, where the Jews were pushed out. And she told us, and I was just shocked, that my father had a bar mitzvah, which he never mentioned. So they were both not really quite secular.
Your father had a bar mitzvah, which is interesting since his mother was not Jewish.
Yeah.
He would not be considered Jewish, and yet...
I don't know how those things worked in Germany at that time. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just that my great aunt told me that, he did have a bar mitzvah. And he was sitting at the table at the time when she was telling us. And it was pretty funny.
That is quite interesting.
Yeah, and he came
But
out
he never.
he came out of the war with an absolute hatred isn't the right word for religion in general. I was raised completely without any kind of religious observances, though I knew I was Jewish, and I had all the moral precepts. They just weren't given names.
I see. So your mother arrived in Shanghai when?
In June of 1939.
And your dad?
In May of 39.
I see.
They didn't know each other. They met later in Shanghai. My mother packed up her family before she left, and she actually hired a railroad car and put all their furniture and everything in there, and sent that to, I assume, Novi Sad at that time.
I see. So let us pick up the story in Shanghai. It's now June 1939, and both of your parents are in Shanghai.
Yes.
What happened there?
Well, my mother's engagement broke off, and she told me that she was very lonely. She didn't know anyone. She was living in this community. I don't know exactly where she was living at that point in time, but she went to the movies one night. They had movies, they had theaters, they had everything. They tried to set up the refugees that came, which were between 20 and 30,000 from 37 to 39, 1937 to 39. They came as a gush when it became known that you didn't need a passport or a visa to get into Shanghai. And do you want me to talk about that a little bit, why you didn't need that? Shanghai is considered an open city. It was called an open city. It had been taken over by Western powers after the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars, and divided up among the various Western powers. There was a French concession, there was an international concession, which was the Americans and the Brits, and then there was the Chinese city, and then after 1937, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese took over a section of the city. And because nobody controlled the city as a whole, the day-to-day administration was done by the Shanghai Municipal Council, everything in English, by the way. My birth certificate is in English. But there was nobody to handle the international affairs, so no visas or passports were needed. It was just an open city, you just could come. So my mother, as I said, she went to the movies one night, and the couple in front of her were singing, when they came out, singing an old Hungarian folk song, and she joined in, and they started talking. They went for coffee. She and the woman of the pair hit it off very well. They became friends, and the woman asked her about her circumstances, and she explained, and the woman said, well, I have this big house that I live in. I'm happy to rent you a room. So she went to live there, and this woman's name was Ilonka, and Ilonka was a fixture of my childhood and her house. She lived in the French concession in a huge mansion, as I remember it. I remember it had a big marble staircase that I liked to, this must have been after the war, but I'd like to bounce down on my seat down the marble staircase. But anyway, Ilonka rented my mother a room, and Ilonka had an interesting way of making a living. Everybody was scrambling to make a living. The refugees came penniless. And she had a boarding house, not where people lived, but it was for young men, or it was for men, single men. There were an awful lot of single men as refugees there that came to her house for one solid warm meal a day. They ate there for their evening meal, their dinners, and my mother helped out with that. And one of the young men that came for dinner was my father, and my parents met that way and eventually married. My mother said that he courted her with bringing flowers all over the front lawn. And my father learned Chinese. He had a great facility for languages, and he learned Chinese almost immediately. he was very fluent. He spoke several languages anyway. He spoke English, German, French, Italian, Chinese, and could swear in every language under the sun, Arabic and so forth and so on.
My goodness. What year did they marry?
They married in 41.
And you were born in
42.
42.
Yeah.
So tell me about your earliest memories.
My earliest memories. I remember being in my crib. And I need to back up here because after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese took the entire city. The nationals of the Allied nations, the British, the Americans, the Dutch, so forth, were immediately interned, and that story is told in Steven Spielberg's film, The Empire of the Sun, with a very young Christian Bale as the little boy. And they were put in internment camps. The Jewish community was left alone for a while. And then the Nazis sent a new envoy to Tokyo. His name is Meisinger. And Meisinger had a varied history already. He was also had the nickname of the Butcher of Warsaw. And he came to Tokyo to take care of the Jewish problem in Shanghai. And he tried to talk the Japanese authorities into doing something about the Jews, put them in concentration camps, starve them to death, put them on ships and blow all the ships up in the harbor, or so forth. And the Japanese admiral who was in charge of the city didn't do anything. And there's a story as to, I'm going on a tangent because it's important. There's a story as to, people ask, why didn't the Japanese do whatever the Germans wanted, or the Nazis wanted? And there's some thought is that they thought that maybe it would have unexpected consequences, or that they wouldn't be able to negotiate with the Russians or the Americans. But there's a story that's told about why it may have happened. Apparently, the governor of the city of Shanghai, this admiral, he called the leaders of the Jewish community into his office and said to them, why do the Germans hate you so much? And the head of the Jewish community, which was a Rabbi Kalish by name, he said, and he thought about it very carefully because he knew that the fate of the community was in his hands. He said in Yiddish, because we are Orientals. And the Japanese just took that in and nothing happened. But couldn't go on without anything happening. So in February of 1943, they set out a proclamation that anybody that came to Shanghai between 37 and 39 had to move into what they called the designated area, which was really what would later be called the Hongqiu Ghetto. And it was already a slum area in the worst part of Shanghai. It was already terribly crowded. Something happened. I'm sorry, there's something that came on the screen. I got distracted.
Well, I don't know what that was, but...
Silas is looking.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Silas is taking care of it.
Okay.
Anyway, the proclamation said that anybody that came between 1937 and 1939, Jews, had to move into this designated area. And it was a 1 mile square area, already terribly crowded by Chinese. And they moved 10,000 or more Jewish refugees into that area. And people that came earlier could stay outside of the designated area. And you had to move in by May of 1943. And I'd already had all kinds of childhood diseases, and my mother was very concerned about my health. And the best hospital in Shanghai at that time was the Mount Moriah Hospital where I had been born, but it was near the ghetto area or in the ghetto area. I'm not quite sure. And she couldn't have had better medical care because it was fully staffed by 200 Viennese doctors that had fled Vienna. And she talked my father into moving into the designated area. He didn't want to. He absolutely didn't want to. And he thought, well, they could just melt into the background because neither one of them looked stereotypically Jewish at all. My father was 6'1", 6'1", you know, he was a very tall man. And so they moved into the ghetto. And the first memory that I have is, I want to say I'm in my crib and I'm supposed to be taking a nap, and I'm hearing planes going overhead, and it's the American forces that are bombing Shanghai. And every time I hear a propeller plane today, I can kind of visualize that time. I was never frightened during those years. That's an interesting point. And that was because my father was absolutely determined that I shouldn't have any trauma about what was happening. And for example, when we go down to the air raid shelters with all the children and so forth, he would tell them stories so that I wouldn't be frightened. And I don't know how frightened my parents were themselves. They were very resilient people. So, you know, I'm sure they were frightened, but they managed, they coped. And I also remember the bombing of Shanghai, which was probably a little bit later. Shanghai was, the worst bombing was on July 17th, 1945, just before the end of the war. And I was in a nursery school. I was the youngest. I was there only as a favor to my mother. She knew the women that were running the school. And the bombing started, and the Americans were looking for a radio transmitter, and they didn't know where it was exactly. So they bombed a whole swath of the city at noon. And that swath of the city happened to be the ghetto area. And the Chinese, of course, sit outside at lunchtime, eating their lunches out on the sidewalk. And there was carnage. There was many, many deaths. I don't know how many Jewish refugees were also killed. And I remember they took us down to the basement of this building. And this is also one of my earliest memories. And I remember the ceiling flaking down. And I laughed. I thought that was so strange. And then they took us out of the building, the women that were in charge of the nursery school. And there were probably about 20 children and 2 women. And they put a rope around the oldest child's waist and one child after another. And I was the tail of the snake, and walked us out of that area to safety. And when I finally got reunited with my parents that day, I was very excited. I told my mother, I saw a man on the street, and he's leaning against a wall, and then he fell down, and he never got up again, Mommy. I'd seen somebody die, obviously. And death was not unusual there because, during the worst times, the death carts came every morning to pick up mostly the Chinese that died of starvation and disease and the cruelty of the Japanese and so forth. And so they would come, I remember that very distinctly. They would come in the morning and pick up the dead off the streets in the ghetto in Shanghai. And then there are, of course, ghetto stories. Want to hear those?
I want to hear it all. Yes, yeah. Please.
Well, we, as I said, we moved into the ghetto. And the building that we moved in was on Ward Road. And it was a typical building that was used for the Jewish refugees. Some refugees lived in the Chinese houses in the ghetto, which were called lane houses because they were little lanes. And they were very, very primitive. And we lived in one of the bigger buildings where there was maybe 100 people in the building, and in the main rooms there would be iron bunk beds, and the only privacy were blankets in between, that kind of situation. And of course a communal kitchen and communal bathrooms, which were probably, none of which were probably very clean. And my parents couldn't live that way. I don't know how they managed, who they bribed, but they got a tiny little room at the very top of the building, top of the house that was extremely hot in summer and extremely cold in winter. And unbeknownst to them, when they moved in with a bed, a table, and a crib, that was how big the room was, that they were also sharing it with other creatures. For example, my mother said that she got up in the middle of the night to check on me and found a large rat sleeping next to me.
Oh.
The rats were all over the place. And of course, cats were worth their weight in gold. So mother got kittens, and the kittens either died on their own or were killed by the rats. And finally, they were able to get a big black tomcat, and which they named Black Peter, which is Schwarzpeter is a character in German literature, children's literature. And he stayed for a while, and then he disappeared too. Somebody probably kidnapped him or catnapped him too. And we had a friend in Shanghai, which brings us all the way back to Berlin just after Kristallnacht. His name was Herbert Brown, and he was friends with my family in Berlin. And Herbert had heard about the ability to go to Shanghai without passports, and he had told my family about that and some various other friends. But he came on the same ship with his widowed mother to Shanghai, and he has an interesting story on that point too. He was very wealthy. He lived in the best part of Berlin in Grunwald, which is a suburb, and they had a big mansion. And after the Nazis took over, both Göring and Goebbels wanted the mansion. And it would have been very easy if only one of them had wanted it. They just would have gotten rid of the owner. But he used that as his advantage to get from Göring safe passage for himself and his widowed mother to Shanghai. So Göring got the mansion. But anyway, Herbert Brown was my Uncle Brown, as I always referred to him, though he was not a relative. But in Europe, older people are referred to, close family friends, as uncle and aunt, even if they're not biologically so. So Herbert Brown came one night into this room in the ghetto, and he was quite drunk, and he had a big gunny sack, and he pulls out this big black and white Tom. Well, it's not Black Peter at all. It's another cat. And he says, "Oh, I found Black Peter." And mother, "It's not Black Peter." But they had a little bit of meat, and the mother gave the meat to the cat, and the cat stayed. And that cat, he was Big Tom. He was a fixture of our lives in Shanghai until we left. And so there were the rats, the mice, and so forth. And the other thing, what can I tell you about mail? Mail went through to Germany still from 1939 till the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. So I have postcards with my father had sent to his family in Munich from Shanghai, and it says Central Post Office, Shanghai, as the return address. And other things that were strange, for example, you wouldn't think that there was so much cruelty about the Japanese. You wouldn't think that they would have a different side to them. It turned out that they loved children and they loved the movies. One day, and this is a very famous story, my mother and father both told, one day a very large touring car drove into the ghetto, and Japanese soldiers jumped out, and a Japanese officer, they stopped at our building and demanded to know where we lived. And then they came pounding up the stairs. And of course, my mother was terrified because it was just like the Gestapo, and they knocking on the door, and she opens the door and there are all these Japanese soldiers standing there. And she explains, my father's at work, he's not there. And they said, "Oh, we haven't come for that," explained the translator. "We understand there's a little girl living here who looks like Shirley Temple." And they, all over the world, Shirley Temple was a phenomenon. And so I was brought out, and the officer gave me some candy. I was admired. They stayed maybe 10 minutes, and then they left. He wanted to see the little girl that looked like Shirley Temple. And I had blonde curls and dimples and blue eyes. And stories that you wouldn't imagine, but did happen.
Do you remember yourself that episode?
No, not very well. No,
Not
I was
very well.
tiny. I was tiny.
Yeah. Yes, you were. So you learned how you took your first steps in the ghetto.
Yeah, I spoke some Chinese. My mother never learned Chinese, but I would translate for her in the market. I don't remember any Chinese anymore at all. I came to this country speaking German, and because that's how my parents spoke German among themselves. The one language my father never learned was Hungarian. He didn't have any interest in that. It's just kind of amusing. But and I started school in the kindergarten in Shanghai. The American Joint Distribution Committee had a very large presence in Shanghai since the early 30s. And they were the main group that organized the refugee support work at that time. When the refugees came between 37 and 39, a huge amount of refugees, many of them just totally destitute. I mean, my father always had skills. He was a German engineer. He could fix anything, and he always had work. But many people were very, very destitute. And the other Jewish communities in Shanghai, because Shanghai had a long presence of Jewish community there since the 1830s, when Iraqi Jews had come, the Kanduris, the Hundurs, and people like that, 400 families. And then, of course, the Ashkenazis came around the turn of the century because of the pogroms, and they came through the Trans-Siberian Railroad over to Harbin and then down to Shanghai. And then there were all the Russian refugees that came after the Russian Revolution. So there was a community of a Jewish community that tried to help the refugees. But they were all at cross purposes. Things got very chaotic. I mean, they needed to set up soup kitchens. They needed to set up medical care. They needed to set up housing. And they needed to negotiate with the Chinese authorities. They needed to negotiate with the Japanese authorities. And finally, the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, sent out a professional social worker. Her name was Laura Margolis. And she set about organizing everything. She knew she had a very small window of opportunity because she knew if the Americans came into the war, she'd be interned as an enemy alien. And she was eventually. But she did set up soup kitchens and all that kind of thing and negotiated with everybody that needed to be negotiated with.
Getting back, unmute myself here. Yeah. Getting back to the little girl that looked like Shirley Temple. Do you remember any details? Do you remember what you ate? Do you remember being hungry?
My mother cooked on. I'll get to that. He's reminding me of something. My mother cooked on a brazier stove, like most of the refugees had to. Those are the little stone stoves that you've seen in Chinese pictures. I should have taken it out. I have a little miniature. And we ate what the Chinese ate, which many of the Jewish people who didn't want to eat Chinese food because of their aesthetic proclivities or were very, very Orthodox, they were the only ones that starved. There was food. It just wasn't very good food. You were hungry, but you weren't starving. I mean, my father always said, they'd rather starve to death than eat what the Chinese eat. We ate what the Chinese ate. We survived. I remember when, after the war, when you finally could get something, the first time a canned ham came in. I mean, my parents just devoured that just to have, something, a Western food, that kind of thing. I mean, a ham, obviously, they were religious. But I don't remember being hungry. I don't at all.
Do you remember what you did eat? You ate
I have no idea.
Chinese.
I have no
What was
idea.
that?
I don't remember.
No.
I was too small. I don't remember. Uh, as I said, my father always had work, so that he always had some money in there. And if you had the ability to work, you could go from the ghetto to the other parts of the Chinese city, occupied by the Japanese. You cross something called the Garden Bridge because there's a big river that transects Shanghai, the Huangpu River. Even though it's on the Yangtze, but there's a river that goes into Shanghai, and you cross the Garden Bridge, but you had to go through a checkpoint, and the checkpoint was controlled by a sadistic little Japanese officer named Kanyo, and he particularly hated white men, and particularly hated tall white men because he was a little guy, and he'd get up on his table on his desk where he was handing out the passes, and if he thought you weren't being respectful enough, he'd slap you across the face, or the punishment that he liked the most was to give you smallpox vaccinations, which were very painful and left horrible scars. My father had smallpox vaccinations on both arms, where he'd been. So Goya called himself the king of the Jews. He controlled the ghetto. And no, I don't remember food as such. I know that when I had, there must have been fruit, because one of the things I did have in Shanghai was, as I said, I had the ghetto was disease-ridden, and it started out that I had sniffles, and my parents thought, well, it's just sniffles, and then I had a convulsion. And so they called the doctor. The doctor came and said, you're crazy. Nothing's happening, because I was already better by the time the doctor got there. And this happened 3 or 4 times. And the last time it happened, the doctor that came was an older doctor who'd served in the First World War. And he said, the child's fine. What are you so worried about? And he started to go down the stairs, and I had another convulsion. And my mother screamed for him to come back. And he took one look at what was happening, and he said, oh my God. Well, he didn't say, oh my God, but you know what I mean? Because they had something in the hospital, and they didn't know what it was. And he had seen meningitis, spinal meningitis in the First World War, which is very common in crowded conditions. You find it in college dormitories, for example, or wartime, or soldiers and so forth, because it's very contagious. And that's what I had. And of course, I was isolated, put in the hospital and isolated and so forth. And they didn't have any penicillin in Shanghai. They had no antibiotics. The only thing they had was a little bit of sulfa drugs. And they made the calculated decision that the youngest and the most likely to survive should be given the sulfa drugs. And I was given that. And they still didn't know whether I had any residual from the meningitis. And because people would have brain damage or blindness or total hearing loss or died, or usually died. But anyway, when I was in the hospital in isolation, my mother told a story about being on the streetcar, and some woman said, oh, this morning I was at the hospital and one of the children died again. And my mother was frantic. She said, the little blonde girl with the curls? And she said, oh no, the little blonde girl was sitting up eating an apple. I got all the way back to food. So there were apples.
Do you remember anything about clothing?
Clothing? What do I remember about clothing? Something very funny. It's wartime. It's very hard to wash things. Everything is very, very difficult. And my mother said, when I was 2 or 3, she said, you were so finicky. If you got one spot on yourself, you would demand that I change your clothes. No, I don't remember much about clothing at all, other than, I must have had very nice clothing because my mother could sew. And she worked in Shanghai. She worked for a children's clothing company, and all kinds of things like that, as well as secretarial work. So I was never badly dressed, from the time I was very, very tiny. I mean, she crocheted and knitted my underwear, for example. That kind of thing. She could do anything as far as clothing was concerned. But
So you probably had shoes.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
And I remember I had very weak ankles. My father insisted that I have high-topped shoes so that my ankles would grow straight. And how they got all this, I don't know, other than it was where they got everything. I have no idea. I know that they sold everything they owned, all the nice things that they came to Shanghai with. My father, his mother sent him off to Shanghai as though he was going to the moon with everything you can possibly imagine. She had no concept of what Shanghai was like. And, Viola shirts and leather gloves and this, all that. And of course, he sold it all piecemeal in the hungry years, as did my mother with her things.
How about toys? Do you remember anything that you played with?
I didn't. You mean with toys? Oh, toys. I thought you said boys. No, toys.
Oh, no.
Toys.
Toys.
Yeah. I know that, and this was not during the war. This was right after the war. I had little tiny figurines that I liked to play with, and my mother couldn't figure out why they all disappeared. They were always disappearing, and finally she found out that the cat was stealing them from me and hiding them behind a bookcase. The toys. What do I had some picture books, and she bought me, and I still have them, some very large dolls that are made out of cloth, Chinese dolls. And she tried as hard as she could to give me as normal a childhood as possible. I did go to some birthday parties. I remember having one birthday party with the tail on the donkey, but this was all after the war. And I don't remember in the ghetto. I mean, I have, pictures, which I don't know if you can see that. My mother and father and myself, obviously I'm dressed. So, I had clothes. Yeah. So, clothes, no, I don't really remember, other than it must have been fine.
What was your understanding, if any, of what was happening in the world around you?
I don't think I
Did you understand the war?
Only, there was the bombing. I don't think I understood much. I was 3.5 when the war ended, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't think I didn't know any different. When you don't know any different, you have no point of comparison when you're that tiny. But I started, I started kindergarten then, after the war, the JDC kindergarten, the Jewish kindergarten, which was run in German. We didn't speak English. I think it was a German speaking. I don't remember terribly much about it, except that I first loved it very much, and then all of a sudden I absolutely hated it. My parents were working, and Uncle Brown came to pick me up at school, and he found me absolutely in tears and hysterical, and I didn't want to go back to school. And the teacher that I had loved, I absolutely couldn't stand her anymore. And for years, her name just gave me the creeps, and I never knew why. It's a repressed memory. I have no idea. But I have pictures of myself sitting in the kindergarten, well, not in the kindergarten, but outside, with a big frown on my face. I'm the one with the frown on my face, the big blonde curl. And because I didn't want to be there. I don't know what happened. No idea. I've talked to my friends that were in Shanghai at the same time, and they all loved that woman. So I don't know. Somehow I got crossways with her, and something happened that made me very unhappy.
So I was going to ask you if you could tell me what your best and worst experiences in the ghetto were, but perhaps you really don't remember.
I don't remember.
You don't remember. You were very young.
I was very young. And, you know, I was so small. I remember so much more about the end of the war than I do during the ghetto years, really. You know, once I told you about the bombing of the city and that, you know, we were taken to safety. My parents had agreed that depending on the time of day, you know, if something happened in the morning, my father would come and get me, or the afternoon, my mother would come and get me. They'd go to that to that nursery school. And my father was the first one through all that carnage, and he couldn't find me. They couldn't tell him where the children had been taken. And when he did finally find me, he just grabbed me and ran. He didn't thank the women that had saved the children. My mother had quite a job the next day smoothing the feathers of those women, because he hadn't been as polite as they thought he should be. But as I said, my dad spoke very fluent Chinese. And so he heard from the Chinese after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when Shanghai was waiting to be liberated. So, you know, that was August, the bombings, and it was hot. It was humid. Shanghai's very hot and humid in summer. And there would be all these rumors running around that the Americans are coming, and everybody would run down to the Bund, which is the main part of Shanghai, right on the sea, on the river. That's what you see in all the movies and postcards and so forth, the Bund, because they have all these European buildings that were built by various concessions and rich men and so forth. And they'd look for the ships, and the ships wouldn't be there. This went on for weeks. And meanwhile, my father had heard from his Chinese friends that there were white men at the airport. And he decided that he wanted to investigate that. So he just took me, just the two of us, and we walked to the airport. Now, how far I walked, I'm just guessing, because I was mostly sitting up on his shoulders. This big, tall white man with a little tiny girl on his shoulders. And we walked out to the airfield, which is now the Shanghai International Airport. And sure enough, there were Americans out there. They had come over the hump, which is the Himalayas. They were Chennault's and Stilwell's men. And they just were so surprised to see a tall white man with a little girl, blonde curls, and who spoke English, because my father spoke English, heavily accented German English, but he spoke very fluent English. And that's when I had my first chocolate bar. I'd never eaten chocolate before, a Hershey bar, you know, that kind of thing. You ask about food. After the war, when I had my first ice cream, I'd never had ice cream before. It didn't agree with me, and my mother had a white piqué dress on, very pretty dress that she obviously made herself. And I proceeded to vomit all over her. The ice cream was too cold for my system. She'll never let me forget that. But, we went out, and my dad and I, and we found the airmen out at the airfield. And then finally on September 5th, the Americans did arrive, and the city was liberated. And all of a sudden, the ghetto the Japanese weren't there anymore. And they seemed to just, from one day to the next, dematerialize. They just left. It wasn't guarded anymore. And it turned out, of course, that they'd gone back in their barracks to wait for the Americans, because the war was over. And there was a huge ticker tape parade down Nanking Road, which is the main road in Shanghai, when the Americans finally did come. And I heard my first English words, America, Roosevelt, Truman, the first American songs, English songs. I've been working on the railroad, and you are my sunshine, all those kind of things. And my mother said she was terrified, not because the Americans were there, but because the news from Europe, she was terrified what it would bring, because there was no mail. They had no idea anymore what could be there. And she was particularly frightened for how my father would react if anything had happened to his father. And finally, the lists came in, and they were lists of the living, because the dead were so many, just the living. And there's a very famous picture of the refugees all looking at the lists. And then the news came that my grandfather had died at Auschwitz, and and her little sister had disappeared. My mother's little sister had disappeared off the streets of Budapest, and most of those relatives in Novi Sad, my mother's father's family, were all gone, and my grandfather's 4 or 5 of his siblings were also gone in the Holocaust. So I lost a tremendous amount of family. There were very few of us left, and I have no first cousins. I have quite a few, less than 12 second cousins, all of whom I'm very close to and friends with. And I'm the only grandchild on both sides of my family. And where it should have been it should have been a real pyramid. For my family, it's the other way around. I'm the end right there.
So tell me about what happened after liberation.
After liberation,
your family moved.
Well, we moved out of the ghetto as quickly as we could. My father immediately got work with the American forces in the motor pool because he could fix the vehicle. And, our situation changed radically. We had an apartment. Our cat came with us, of course. I can remember neighbors and people that had been in the ghetto with us. I remember one woman that I was always fascinated in a horrified way, because I had seen what had happened to her in the ghetto. Living in those close communal situations with so much tension and stress and so forth, people react badly sometimes with each other. And as I said, in the ghetto, there was a communal kitchen, and 2 women were fighting. I don't know what they were arguing and fighting about, and I happened to be there. My mother wasn't. I don't know why. I was down there with a neighbor, and the women were arguing and screaming at each other, and one woman grabbed a pot of boiling water off a stove and threw it at the other woman's hands. And, she screamed in agony, and I was taken out of there immediately. But she also lived in the same building after the war that we lived in, and her hands always shook. And, I remember that incident very well, because I remember the screaming. And you asked me if there were any bad memories. I do remember that one. And, she ironed funny things. She could iron her pillowcases and her sheets, this is after the war, by sitting on them carefully, which was funny. And I remember there was a little neighbor girl who had long, long curls, and we got a hold of a scissor, and I cut off a couple of her curls, and oh my goodness, the fuss. Everybody was so angry with me. My turn was going to be next, by the way. And I remember being taken to the park. I have pictures of myself with other children, some of whom I've actually gotten in touch with over the years, over the internet. And because, where there was a woman that was a babysitter, and she took the children to the park. And I have a picture of the woman in Auburn, Alabama. Actually, I just talked to her very recently. And we were with a Chinese man, and he's obviously a very well-educated man from the way he's dressed. He's got his little tiny boy with him, and he wanted a picture with the 2 European children. And I'm obviously the blonde, the curls. And so my father worked for the motor pool, and then after a year or so, he got the job that he loved the most in his life. He became chief engineer, and this is a pretty heady position for a man still in his 20s. of the pilots' boats of Shanghai, the city of Shanghai. Shanghai's 50 miles up the river from the sea, and you have to have pilot boats to take the big vessels upriver so they don't get caught in the shoals and so forth. And he was the engineer for all the pilots' boats for the city of Shanghai. And he loved that job. He loved China. He would have never left if it hadn't been, if he didn't have a wife and a child. You know, he was very, very happy in China. But of course, the political situation with the communists and the Civil War and all that made things very different. And after the war, after the Second World War, the Civil War between the forces of the communist forces of Mao Zedong and the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek resumed. And it was pretty clear from that point on that Mao Zedong would win. People were so hungry. We had no concept of how hungry they were and miserable. I had, for example, after the war, I had children's nurse, you know, all the Westerners did, called an ama. And I loved her very much. And she loved me, but our cat absolutely hated her. Cat would grab her on the stairs, grab its claws around her legs, and she was terrified of the cat. It turned out that she was stealing the cat's food to take home to her children because they were so hungry. I was taken once to visit her children, and the neighbors were horrified. They said to my mother, that I'd be kidnapped, that they never see me again. And my mother said, it's fine. She'll bring her back. And I had a great time. I mean, I was fascinated. I'm not like 4, and these people are living in a cave with a tar paper door, and the children are laughing at me because I can't eat properly with chopsticks. I eat like a baby with a spoon. And, and the cold in winter. And you would see, after the war, you would see we had a rickshaw driver to take my father to work and take me to school and mother shopping and so forth, and had him on salary. And I loved him very much. His name is Ani. And you would see this rickshaw driver pulling the rickshaw in a very worn European, very nice European top coat, which had belonged to my father. That kind of thing. So if people are that hungry, you promise them a bowl of rice, they'll follow you anywhere. And the nationalists were so corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek was so corrupt. And it was just obvious that it was, he was not going to win. And the Westerners started leaving almost immediately to any place they could go. Everybody wanted to go to the United States, or not everybody, but most people. But it was very difficult. In 1947, there was still a very strict quota system that had been in place since the 1930s, to keep Jews out of the United States. And that didn't end until the 1948 Displaced Persons Act under the Truman administration, which is what we came in under. And my papers all say, they say displaced person on them, the DP stamp on them. And so, people went to the United States if they could get in. They went to Canada, they went to Australia, South Africa, and of course to Israel. And some people went back to Europe. And Ilona, who we talked about before, who had the mansion, she went back to East Berlin, and Mother wrote to her for a while, but the letters came back undeliverable. We don't know what ever happened to her. We don't know if she found the workers' paradise that she wanted. She was very leftist. And Uncle Brown, Herbert Brown, went back to Berlin after he tried several times to get my aunt to marry him. He'd always been in love with my aunt. Actually, my aunt left London in 1950, and she went to Israel to live permanently, to be with her family. And he came, I think he came maybe once or twice to try to convince her to marry him. And she'd never been attracted to him. She wasn't going to marry him then. And he was always referred to himself as Der Dicke. He was fat, and fat he remained. He was a big, fat, bald man, very sweet. And he was also, he liked to take the main chance on things. My father was scrupulously honest. He was Socratic that way. And he told the story about Herbert wanting to get him to go in with him and a bunch of other men on a black market scheme to steal tires from the Army motor pool, the U.S. Army motor pool. And my father said to him, not only will you get arrested, but any chance of coming to the United States with an arrest record will be gone. Well, they went through their, he didn't join them, obviously. He told them to get lost. And of course they got arrested. I mean, it was kind of, from what I heard, it was like a episode on MASH. You know, they did everything wrong that they could do wrong. And of course he couldn't get into the United States. So he went back to Berlin. And after much wrangling and trouble with the West German authorities, he got his house back, his mansion. And he eventually married a widow in Berlin. And my aunt married my uncle in Israel. And so, you know, they went back. So those are the people that went back to Europe. We left in July of 48 on a American troop ship that was picking up soldiers from various ports and places throughout the Pacific. And it was called the SS General Meigs. And when we left the city of Shanghai, we left the harbor, all of a sudden, all the pilot boats in the whole city started blowing their whistles. And of course, nobody knew what it was for except my parents and myself, that it was, you know, a farewell to my dad. They were saying goodbye to him. And we stopped in Manila, Guam, Honolulu. And in Honolulu, I saw the ocean really for the first time, a beach. And I remember I ran into the surf and my dress got wet, and the taxi driver hung my dress out the window so it would dry in Honolulu. And then we came to San Francisco and in July of 48. And I can remember this, I remember quite clearly, this real sense of excitement as we came under the Golden Gate Bridge. And all of a sudden you look back and there's this big rainbow over the bridge, kind of a omen of, I don't know, of the things to come, a portent of maybe of good things or of bad things. But I do remember it was foggy and gray like it is in San Francisco in July, and then this rainbow. And my father immediately started working at the bus station after we got settled. But when we landed in San Francisco, I immediately got sick. It turned out I had scarlet fever. I somewhere had gotten that. And I quarantined the Powell Hotel, which is now a very fancy boutique hotel, but was at that time requisitioned for the refugees. And they had to, it was quarantined for 2 weeks while I got over scarlet fever. Couldn't have been very nice for the people that were living there at the time. And then we moved to Oakland because it was easier to find housing there. And even that was really, really difficult. My mother, I remember, she had migraines, and we'd been looking for a place to live. She was still in the hotel in San Francisco. And it was a hot summer day, and my dad and I went together to Oakland, had the newspaper. In those days you had ads, for housing rentals, and nobody wanted to rent to people with children. And of course, the returning servicemen had priority over everybody else. And so, it was really, really difficult. And I remember walking with my dad from place to place. I'm now 6. And finally we stopped at a house, and the man came out, an older man, and he said, well, we don't want to rent to children, people with children. And the woman came out behind him, and she said, oh, she's just such a little girl. She can't be much trouble. And those were the first people that rented to us, and they were lovely people. They really showed us, after all those terrible years, of what America was about. And they treated my mother like another daughter. They had 5 daughters, no sons. And they had all the son-in-laws, but they, and they had whole passel of grandchildren, but no girls. So I was the little girl that they all wanted that. And they were the kind of people that said to my parents at one point, you had never had a honeymoon, you never had a vacation. And my father by this time had a car. My father couldn't live without a car. And it was an old Ford, really banged up. And they said, go south, go to Monterey, go to Carmel for a week, and we'll take care of the child. And they sent them off, lighthearted, to have a week after all those years. And of course, there are things like I remember this kind of, everybody was terribly excited. And I didn't know, I kept hearing the word Truman. And Mother and I didn't speak very much English at that time. I didn't speak any English at that time. But my father was terribly excited, and all the men stayed up to listen to the returns for the Truman election. They were terribly excited. The house was full of Democrats. They were all Democrats. And then they said that, well, there's a holiday coming up, and we all share the meal and so forth, and we'd like, come join us, to my parents. And that was our first Thanksgiving. They were really, really nice people. We kept in touch with them for many, many years. But it was not easy. Don't think it was easy. It was not. I mean, my father, he had a very, very hard time dealing with his father's death. He never got over it. He had a very contentious relationship with his mother. He blamed her for not having stuck with his father, having gotten divorced. He felt she could have saved him. Some women were able to do that. There's a movie called Rosenstrasse. I don't know if you know it or not. It's about Christian women in Berlin married to Jewish men who do save them because they don't abandon them. And he had a very hard time. It was very, very difficult. Mother she kept things inside of herself much more. I mean, I knew about my aunt from the time I was a small child. She told me in bits and pieces as I was old enough to understand, what had happened to my aunt. And of course, by the time I read the Diary of Anne Frank, I always fantasized that we would find my aunt and that she'd be all right. My mother's youngest sister. Of course, never found her at all. I did a lot of research after both my parents had died, starting with the Red Cross, and I finally found a small typed card from the Bad Arlsten archives, which is where they had a lot of Holocaust documents, open to the public in 2007 for the first time. Can you imagine? They didn't open those documents until then because there were 13 nations involved and they couldn't agree on anything. So I got that card and it said, she'd been seen at Ravensbrück, the concentration camp outside of Berlin, where they took most of the Hungarian women. And it says fate unknown. It's in German, of course. And interesting line to that is that Dan and I were in Washington, D.C. We went to the Holocaust Museum, U.S. Holocaust Museum, and they have a research office on the second floor, and I went up there to see if I could find anything that I hadn't been able to find online and so forth. I'd been to Yad Vashem, but that I could find that I could read and so forth. And went up there, and I had emailed them quite a bit, asking questions and so forth over the years. And the man that was at the desk, when I said, I was looking for my aunt, he said, "Are you Angie Rooney?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Oh yeah, I've seen your emails," and he said, "You've seen that?" I said, "All I've seen is the card from Bad Arlsen," and he said, "Oh, I have the whole backup file. It's not online yet. Would you like it?" He gave me a whole sheaf of documents, none of which told me what had happened to my aunt, but it told me all the people that had searched for her and had hired lawyers and so forth. And all of that was not online at all. So, but anyway, she disappeared. And when I was doing all this research, I was looking to see at one point if my grandfather's grave, my mother's father, who died in 1924, if that existed any place or whether it had been destroyed by the Nazis. I didn't know exactly where that grave was. But I had pictures of it both when I had gone through my mother's things when she died, and my uncle's when he died. They both had pictures of their father's grave. And I went online, and through somebody else, I found this a picture of the main Jewish cemetery in Novi Sad, where his family was from. And they had the same kind of gravestones, big obelisks, big white marble obelisks. And I did a little bit more research, and I finally found an address for the Jewish community in Novi Sad and wrote to them. And the next morning, I had an answer in perfect English. I'll get to that. In perfect English from the secretary of the Jewish community in Novi Sad. And she said that I was very lucky that they had just gotten a grant and they'd cleaned up the cemetery that year. And she would go out the following Sunday and see if she could find my grandfather's grave, which she did. And she sent me pictures. And on the grave, obviously my uncle had done this before he had gone, before he and my grandmother immigrated to Israel. It was my aunt's name and her dates, so that she had a place where her soul could be with her father, even though her body is long since gone. So my husband is reminding me that I need to tell you a little bit afterwards. So my father worked for the bus companies first. He wasn't recognized as an engineer here. You know, he would have had to go back to school here and get his degree and all that kind of thing. America makes it very difficult for foreigners to use their credentials. And so instead, he worked for machine shops and as a machinist for quite a while. And then he started a hobby, which he had actually seen in Munich. When he was a little boy, they lived in a very fancy building, but the building next door had a dentist's office, and a hive of bees had gotten into the sofa in the dentist's office. And he was fascinated by the bees. And so when we moved to Los Gatos from Oakland, he found a swarm of bees one day, and he grew that one swarm into a very large business. And he became the third largest honey producer in California. And that sent me to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And he was also an importer, and he made a big business out of a hobby. And I don't know, do you want to see a picture? Can you see a picture? Dan, you can bring that over for me? Oh, he hung it back up. Yeah, so, you know, he was a very, very interesting man. And my husband's just bringing a picture of me with my father and the bees. This was taken for a newspaper article for the Mercury News when I was about probably 11, 12. Did you get it?
So in some ways, your father rebounded and did okay, but in some ways, psychologically, you say he was not.
He had his moments. He had his moments where he had a series of nervous breakdowns, I would call them today. But he always, you know, he had a wife and a child, and he had, you know, he did what he had to do. My parents did what they had to do. You know, they coped, they bounced back, they were resilient.
Do you remember how old you were or how you found out you yourself about your grandfather's death?
Yes, I know exactly. I know exactly because it was so traumatic. I came home from school. I was 16. I came home from school one afternoon. The house was in chaos. And my mother said to me in a very calm voice, "Your grandmother has died." And I thought, why in the world is she so calm? Because she was so close to her mother. She loved her mother dearly. And my grandmother had heart problems and was never quite well. And then she said, "Your father's mother has died." I never even gave her a thought, frankly, you know, because she was always very robust. I had never thought of my grandmother, my father's mother, as being ill or anything like that. I had spoken to her several times on the telephone, which was a big deal in those days, calling Germany. She would call us. And she was always mad at me because I didn't speak good enough German, and my letters were terrible. I didn't write German well enough. And then my father would get on the phone, and they would argue, and he banged on the phone, and and it was, a big scene. And she would send me outrageous presents that were just not thought out for a small child. She would, one time she sent, this was the worst. My father just had a fit. She sent me a diamond encrusted platinum with a platinum chain, a big cross. Huh? A few years later, I gave it to my cousin who is Catholic, who grew up Catholic. My parents said, "Fine, it's yours. You do whatever you want with it." But she would send completely inappropriate gifts once in a blue moon. I mean, like 3 or 4 times in my whole life, that kind of thing. But they were always very expensive and inappropriate. While my other grandmother, who was the one that I thought would be dead, she would send me gifts constantly, little embroidered things, little knitted things, not expensive things, but things that grandma sends. So anyway, I came home, and my mother informed me that my grandmother had died, and apparently my uncle had called that morning. My father had 2 older siblings that were half siblings. They weren't my grandfather's children. They were my grandmother's children. Previous situation. I don't know I don't think she was ever married to that man or men. I have no idea. I just know that my uncle and aunt were not my grandfather's biological children. My grandparents married in 1914, and he moved from Berlin to Munich at that time. They didn't even know each other before that. And my half aunt and half uncle were born in 1902, 1905, something like that. And called and said that she had died. She'd gone on winter vacation to Garmisch-Partenkirche, which is a big ski resort. And the maid had found her dead in the room. She died of a heart attack. Yeah. She left complete chaos. Of course, then, when my parents are talking, this is all going on, and then it comes out, my father mentions that his father died at Auschwitz. I went to pieces. I was 16. I had no idea. The only thing my father had ever said to me about his father was, he would have loved you. My father would have loved you. And my mother felt it was not her place to tell the story. She could tell me about her sister, all about the Holocaust and so forth, but she didn't, he didn't want to talk about it. It was his story. So I went to pieces. It was a very, very traumatic year for me. My father flew, that was probably on a Thursday. He was scrambling for a passport. They got him a passport on an emergency basis. He didn't have a winter coat. It was January to fly into Munich, with and he flew into, he got on the plane. He was the last one on the plane. And you know how much he hated flying anyway. And he gets to Frankfurt, and there's a blizzard in Munich. They can't land. He has to hire a taxi from Frankfurt to Munich, which is a long distance, must have cost a fortune. He arrived in Munich, from what I heard, like the prodigal son walks into the cathedral where they're having the her funeral. She's having a big funeral, and he walks in quite, I don't know whether his brother and sister knew that he was coming at all. I mean, his brother had informed him of the death, and there was complete chaos. I mean, they had not seen each other for this is 58, for 10 years at least, 10, 11 years. My father's brother never was very nice to him. There was always a great deal of jealousy about the much younger sibling. And then when my grandmother's will was read, She'd forgotten to update her will. She did a will in 1946, probably out of guilt at that point in time. And since she set her other two children up with their own businesses, also art galleries, she left her art gallery, that jewel in the crown, she left everything to my father. And, the other two and the second husband, so there were three of them involved, they were beside themselves. That here comes this guy, he hasn't been around for 12 years, and he gets everything. Well, everything turned out to be a big joke because she spent like it was water. And and of course, there were major death duties in Germany. What we got out of the trip, frankly, was the trip. We got nothing else when everything was paid and so forth. And my father sold the gallery almost immediately, as soon as he could find a buyer. And I'm sure he didn't get a decent price for it. He didn't want any part of it. He didn't want the gallery. He didn't want Germany. He didn't want, his siblings, basically. Oh, he loved his sister, but, it was just it was all bad feelings for him. When I was in Munich with him, he went in January for the funeral and stayed. And Mother and I went in May, or April, I can't remember, late April, early May, because I remember he took me to a maypole ceremony, little children with all the maypole stuff. And he took me to the main park, very close to the house where he'd grown up in. And he said to me, see that statue over there? I hid a gun in that when I was a boy. It was very, very illegal under the Nazis for people to have weapons, and particularly Jews. He said, it's probably still in there. I don't know which statue it is. My cousins were asking me the last time we were in Munich, do you know which statue it was where his gun is? I have no idea, can't remember. So, yeah, it was, when I found out about my grandfather, it was really, really upsetting, terribly upsetting. I took it terribly personally. And for a long time, I had real problems thinking about my grandmother, because I blamed her too. And then as I grew older and I saw things no longer as black and white, at 16, you see everything as black and white. There's much that was there that was very hard to understand. And she made the choices that she had to make. She was a survivor. Even in the worst of times, she was sending my grandfather, when they already were divorced and it was highly illegal to send Jews money, she was giving him a monthly payment, so because they were beggared in Munich at the time. And she got caught by the Gestapo, and they threatened to close the gallery and to put her in prison if she didn't stop sending money and food to him. And in those documents, when I went through about my mother's sister, one of the people that paid for lawyers to search for my mother's sister was my grandmother, my father's mother. She was a complex woman, very complex woman. I mean, I have paintings here that come from the gallery, but they're all personal paintings. The picture of my father when he was about 10 or 11 or 12 is over there, the big portrait. The Silas can see that you can't, so forth. And, it was very, very hard. And it's taken me a while to really come to terms with what she was. As I said, I never knew her. I never met her in person. She was always this angry voice on the end of the phone call when she did call. And, but she was always this presence, bigger than life presence in our house. She was always there, as with the gallery. It was my parents talked about the gallery so much, and it was very much of a part of my childhood. And when it's an adult, some years ago, when I started doing research about the gallery and about the paintings and so forth, and I found the Frye Museum in Seattle, and I wrote to them, and they were just they answered immediately and said they had this painting, they had the receipt, they never knew who the people were. They invited us up to Seattle. We went to a ceremony there, so forth and so on. And I did, after many years, in 2018, I arranged for a Stolperstein to be placed for my grandfather in Munich, in front of the house where my father grew up and where they lived, because they usually put them at the last known address. And I said I didn't want that. I wanted him, if there was going to be a memorial to him, it's going to be in the house where he was still happy, not some place where he was terrified and didn't know what was going to happen to him. And so we did that in 2018. It was a great ceremony in Munich. Have I answered everything?
You've been pretty complete. You have not been back to Shanghai, I believe?
No, I've never been back to Shanghai. Meant to a couple of times. I've been to the airport, as I've been on a business trip to Beijing 1 year, and I spent about 6 weeks in Beijing. But I haven't been to Shanghai. I've been.
Do you have no desire to go back?
Yes, but it's been always at the wrong time. We were going to go back just before the pandemic hit. We almost had tickets. And then, life has a way of interfering.
Yes, it does.
And, it's very hard for me to think about, what would I see in Shanghai? What my parents would be different. But I was so small, What I can tell you is that when I was that 6 weeks in Beijing, I was with a Chinese-American co-worker, and we were there for 6 weeks negotiating these contracts, and he was so amused that the smells of because we went to the old parts of the city and so forth, the smells of the cabbage on the streets and the flies and so forth. And he said none of that upset me, and he was very amused about that. I said that I think smell is something that stays in you.
Mm-hmm.
That it was so familiar to me, so it wasn't upsetting. That kind of thing. But Shanghai, I don't know if my Shanghai exists. And what do I remember? Because I mean, people that were older that went to school, that went to sports clubs and so forth. But I was so small at the time. It's really very hard for me to really imagine. I mean, there's a museum in Shanghai now honoring the refugees. There's a wall with 12,000 names. Ours aren't on them. My parents kept very low profile, and they didn't really interact much with the main Jewish community. And my father's friends were Chinese mostly. And I'm not sure what I would see. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm not sure what's there anymore that would mean much to me.
Well, your war experience, for the most part, was just your normal, because you were so very young. It was just normal life to you.
Yeah, other than the bomb shelters and the actual bombing.
Mm-hmm. But you weren't scared.
I wasn't ever scared, and that was because of my father. He just didn't want me to be traumatized. He worked really hard at making sure that I wasn't traumatized. And I think that's an amazing thing to give a child.
Yes. Your father was an amazing man, clearly.
He was an amazing man. He really was. And so was my mother. She's really quite amazing too.
You had amazing parents.
Yeah, I had great parents. I was one of the lucky ones. I had really, really great parents.
And you're an amazing woman as a consequence, perhaps. So
Because my mother said everybody had their own Shanghai. That was her expression. It depended on how you looked at things. Some people were terrified. Some people hated it. Some people didn't like, were upset about every little thing. I mean, I knew a girl from Shanghai that lived in Los Angeles, actually, who's since passed away, but her experiences were exactly like mine. She was just about the same age. And for her, Shanghai was a horrible place because her parents divorced. Her parents were unhappy in Shanghai. Everything was a burden. Everything was horrible. And so her experience in Shanghai was totally different than mine. It's the people around you, particularly when you're young.
Yes.
So I think that basically the bottom line is everybody had their own Shanghai.
Everybody had their own Shanghai.
Yeah,
Well, is there anything you would like to add, or any message you would like to leave for future
generations? Well, I think everybody that was in Shanghai has to thank the Chinese people. I mean, today we have a different relationship with China, but they had so little and they shared what they could. They were really wonderful to the refugees. They were really kind. The city of Shanghai was very good to those people. They gave what they had. They didn't have much. Or they didn't have anything, actually.
So even during that terrible time for the world, humanity still came through.
Yeah, for in that place, in that time and place. And as I said, even the Japanese had really, characteristics that you wouldn't have expected. Yeah. And of course, my experience is totally different than, for example, the little boy in Empire of the Sun, which was the experience of the Americans and the British and the other allied nations that were interned by the Japanese. They had it very difficult. It was very, very hard. Not that the ghetto was a piece of cake, because it wasn't. It was just the ghetto there were so many people, It was a totally different situation. I mean, we were guarded. You couldn't go out unless you had a day pass to work. But it was a different situation. You can't compare the two. Just like you can't really compare a lot of the Holocaust experiences with each other because they were different. That's why there's so many stories about the Holocaust, because every experience was different.
Well, this was your story, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you. Have I missed anything? I was asking my husband if I'd missed anything. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And again, I've asked Silas, and I guess I'll ask you too, is this on some kind of a Vimeo or video or something? People have asked me. That's why I'm asking you.
It's part of the USC Shoah library.
Okay. Is that accessible?
It must be.
It must be.
I must find out.
Okay.
Find out the answer to that question.
Okay,
but
great.
It must be.
Great.
That's why we do these, right?
Yeah. I can look it up on myself, actually, when I think about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Does she know about that?
Yeah, she knows about about my presentation and slideshow and so forth. And I told you that I gave a copy of that to Yad Vashem, and it is on Vimeo.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
covers much of that. I think I've given you more than that has in it.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And we really appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll keep in touch, okay?
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.